This is a program about writing, probably man's second greatest invention. Now, the idea of trying to represent speech in some graphic form, in some written form, in some scratched form, has evidently occurred to men over and over again. The idea of picturing things that we talk about seems to be almost universally human. We have many of these, well, some of them old and some of them relatively modern. American Indians used a kind of picture writing, if you will. But what we're going to be talking about today is writing systems, actual pattern systems to represent language. And particularly the thing we're going to be talking about today is the alphabet. Of all of the writing systems, the most efficient, the most important. Now, our writing system, in order to be able to trace it, we have to go back to one of these early writing systems, one that had been, like many of the systems we have today, ultimately a picture writing system. We have to go back to ancient Egypt, where we have a certain kind of writing system which has fascinated people for a long, long time. The hieroglyphic writing system. Now, I suppose most of us, when we think of the hieroglyphic writing system, actually think of it as a series of pictures, completely a picture writing system. But it wasn't just that. Although actually there were, of course, picture symbols, if you will, ideographs or ideograms in this writing system. These were the hieroglyphics we had on the board just a moment ago, at the beginning of our program. And of course there were pictographic representations of relatively concrete things. The soldier, the eye, a picture of an eye, a giraffe, a corner, a loaf of bread, a plow, the sun. But also there was in this particular writing system an ability to represent actions, to fly, to eat, to go, to weep, with the tears coming out of the eyes, to walk, one leg. And then, too, there were actual pictures that represented concepts, if you will, or ideas. To find, here's a bird getting a worm. South, the plant turned this way. To lead, the symbol of a, this was a ruler's symbol, and this one to rule, a scepter. And then cool, actually water running out of a vase, old age. But don't think that the Egyptian writing system was simply a matter of pictures, and when you saw them, you just simply reacted to them and said old age or to find. No, it was a true system. And actually what they were able to do was to put these various symbols into different kinds of contexts. Now, Egyptian is a language, like many languages, that has what we call homophones, words that sound alike. Let me show you how this system worked with words that sounded alike. For instance, here is a picture of a swallow. And the word for swallow in Egyptian was, well, we transcribe it today, WR, were. Incidentally, Egyptian is a language that is of consonantal root structure. That is, if you were a native speaker of the language, you would know where the vowels would automatically be. In other words, you only needed consonants. Now, WR for swallow, we don't know what the vowels were. Also, there was a word in the language, WR, meaning great, sounded exactly like it. So that you could use this particular symbol to stand for both the word swallow and the word great, depending upon what context it was in. By the same token, take this one. This is a symbol. It represents, obviously, a basket. This could be read, the word DR for basket, or it could also be read, DR, a word that sounded just like it, boundary. And to be sure, at times that you knew which one to read, they used what they call determinatives. This little triangle effect here is a determinative for countries. So that if you put this one with basket, you knew you weren't talking about basket, but boundary, because this would have to do with countries. Now, to us, of course, this particular kind of system is quite cumbersome. But there was one very interesting thing about it, and it's actually the clue and the key to this whole business of the alphabet, our alphabet, ultimately, that we're talking about. That is, the Egyptian system also had symbols that stood for only one consonant. For instance, here on our board, we have several of these. This picture of the hawk, for instance, stood for the consonant sound M. This one, representing water, stood for the consonant sound N. This one, whatever that is, looks like a mouth, stood for the consonant sound R. And in this language, actually, the prepositions were, most of them were monoconsonantal, just one consonant, or perhaps with a vowel in them, we can't tell. So that you could use this now for the preposition with. This one was used often for the preposition through. This one for the preposition against, which was pronounced just R. Now, you could put two of these together. For instance, the one for N together with the one for T. This one being just the T sound. Put these two together, and look what happened. You could put this, the N, together with the T, and out came the preposition NT, which is, we would translate today, of. In other words, what we had here was not just simply a matter of looking at pictures and reading pictures. It was a true writing system. Now, cumbersome as this system was, again, it was a system. Now, hieroglyphics were known, of course, to scholars in the West for many, many years, because the Egyptians decorated their tombs, their public buildings, their monuments with these particular symbols, writing. And Western scholars wondered for many years exactly what they meant. And then, in the year 1799, a great discovery took place. A young officer in Napoleon's army named Champollion discovered the famous Rosetta Stone. This is, of course, a replica of the famous Rosetta Stone, so called because it was found in the Rosetta mouth of the Nile River. And Champollion immediately was extremely excited because he realized that there was a chance that we had the key to the hieroglyphic writing system, because what we have here are three different forms of the same message. That is, the same message written in three different languages. Here is the hieroglyphic. And below it, demotic, a very modern form of ancient Egyptian, if you will, that scholars already knew how to read pretty well, written in the demotic script. And below that, the Greek, which of course scholars knew extremely well. And it was found that the demotic and the Greek said the same message, and it was assumed, therefore, that the hieroglyphic said the same message. And when it was finally deciphered, and it was one of the greatest intellectual achievements that Western man has ever done, to actually decipher this script, when it was deciphered, it was found that here was a message which was written in honor of a very late pharaoh, Ptolemy Epiphanes. And the date actually was 27th of March, 196 BC. And he is being made a god by the priests because he was very nice to the priests in the temple. And stones like these were to be erected in every temple throughout Egypt, letting everybody know that Ptolemy Epiphanes, the pharaoh, had just been made a god. So this is the famous Rosetta Stone, and this was the clue to the hieroglyphic writing. Now our problem is now to trace the alphabet. How did this particular kind of cumbersome system develop into the alphabet? Well, this is what we know. Somewhere on Mount Sinai, there were speakers of a Semitic language. Semitic is a language like Egyptian, which is consonantal in terms of its structure, its root structure. That is, again, if you were a native speaker and you had the consonantal roots, you'd know what the vowels were. These particular religious gentlemen, these Semitic speakers, hit upon the idea of following that principle of the monoconsonantal symbol. One symbol for one consonant sound, and to have that universal, to have that always represent only the same sound. This is one of the great discoveries that man has ever made. The idea of the phonemic or alphabetic principle. Now here's what it looked like. I'm going to trace three of these Egyptian hieroglyphic symbols and let you see how they came to go through their stages until we get them today. Now, here's an ox head symbol. Here is the symbol for a house in hieroglyphics, and here's this one we've had before for water. Now, in the Mount Sinai script, about 1500 BC, here is the way the ox head looked, and here's the one for a house, and here's the one for water. But now, these things were standing for the first consonant only of a word. Here is the Moabite stone, a later Semitic script, and here's what it looked like here, and here are the Hebrew shapes of the letter. Now notice, in the Moabite stone, this thing is turned around on its side, so to speak, and here are still the horns of the ox. Here is the house symbol, and here's what they did with water. Here are the Hebrew letters that came from these. This is these printed, of course, and this the written. Now, in the Semitic languages, this particular symbol stood for the consonant sound in the word aleph, ox, aleph. You hear that little noise? Aleph. Now, we don't have that particular consonant sound in our language, so it's hard for us to hear it. But it was a real important consonant, and that stood for a little glottal catch. This particular symbol stood for the first one in Beth, house, ba, and this, the first in Mem, water, Now, what happened was this. It seems that the Phoenicians, another Semitic-speaking group of peoples, actually brought this alphabet to the Greeks. They were the first Europeans. This idea of a consonantal script now came into Europe. And here is our first step of its history. Came into Europe through the Greeks. Now, the Greeks didn't have any aleph, but they needed symbols for vowels, because Greek, being an Indo-European language, the vowels can't be predicted any more than they could in English. So they took this symbol, now turned it around this way, and it looks very much like our A, you see. Here are the horns of the ox down here now. And they said that will stand for alpha, the A sound, not the consonant. So this was a vowel sound, but the B for beta and the mu, this M for water. In other words, now we have a better kind of alphabet, one that has both representations of consonants and vowels. Now, the Greek form of the alphabet spread throughout Europe in two forms, an East Greek form and a West Greek form. Now, the East Greek form is responsible for the alphabet used by the Russians, the so-called Cyrillic alphabet. Now, for instance, here are the representations of the symbols in the ancient Greek, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, kappa, lambda, mu, and so on. Notice this particular symbol here looks to us like a P. That's rho, stands for R, and this is the PH. Here's the small business, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, of the modern Greek script, the small letters. And here is the Russian alphabet. Notice, alpha, beta, gamma, shapes very, very similar. In other words, the Cyrillic alphabet used by Russian and the Slavic is very close to the East Greek form, which was the one that stayed more or less in Greece. But our alphabet actually comes from a West Greek form, one that was brought to Italy by the Etruscans. And the Romans, when they learned to write Latin, learned from this West Greek form. Now, to trace the alphabet further in Europe, the Germanic-speaking peoples first wrote their language in a combination of these. Now, you may remember that we talked about Gothic, Gothic being the oldest text, that is, the oldest text we have of any Germanic language being Gothic, by this Bishop Ulfilas, who actually invented, if you will, a writing system for Gothic in the 5th century that combined both East and West Greek forms, both the Latin, so to speak, and the Greek alphabets. For instance, this one is definitely from the Greek, this lambda-type symbol here, and this one is definitely from the Greek, looks like Greek C. This one looks much more like a Latin letter, and so on, as does this, although it could have also been a Greek. In other words, this particular alphabet of this beautiful manuscript was a combination of both, but most other Germanic speakers used a writing system called the runes. And scholars don't know exactly what is the history of the runic alphabet. Here's what it looked like. This one here is the symbol for F. This the U, this the thorn, the TH symbol. Looks like a thorn on the side of the branch of a rose tree. And you will notice that these particular, this is an R, and it's a perfectly good R, as we can recognize that one right away. You'll notice that they're very angular because the runes were first carved in wood, and because of the grain of the wood, the shapes of the letters were this way rather than that way, easier to carve. So here is an alphabet, if you will, that comes from either one or both, and scholars don't just know. And incidentally, here under it is one of the oldest inscriptions in any Germanic language. This was found in Denmark, this particular inscription, around a drinking horn. And we don't know whether it's a North Germanic language or a West Germanic language. Scholars are still in doubt, but we do know what it says. It says, Ek Clewagastes Holtingar Honna Tawido. I, Clewagastes, famous guest, Holtingar of the clan of Holt, Horna Tawido, made the horn. So we will find then, we do find our own Germanic languages first written in these very interesting runes. But after the Christianization of most of the Germanic speakers, they used the Latin alphabet, and the Latin alphabet, of course, is the one we use today. Now let's go back in time again for a moment and trace the history of the alphabet, not through Europe, but through the rest of the world. Remember, the alphabet seems to have been the invention of Semitic-speaking peoples. So we are not surprised to find, then, that it was a Semitic group, the alphabet of a Semitic group, that has spread very far and very wide to the east. I'd like to show you now the Arabic letters, some of them. It is the Arabic alphabet, perhaps, that has been the one that has been most widely spread. Now here is the first, well, a symbol in the Arabic alphabet, if you will, the one that stands for this glottal catch, this aleph business again, and also for a long A. Here's the symbol for B. Here the one for L. Here the one for N, and here a vowel symbol written above. This is for U. This is just an idea to give you some of the letter shapes of the Arabic alphabet, which starts here and goes this way rather than the way ours goes. Now, these shapes might not look very much like those hieroglyphics, but actually this thing is an alphabet, very definitely. Once the alphabetic principle is understood, actually the letter shapes become relatively unimportant. And this particular form of an alphabet goes back again directly to that Mount Sinai business and the hieroglyphics before it. Now there's some other kinds of writing systems outside of the alphabet. Oh, incidentally, I should tell you that the Arabic not only is used to write Arabic, but also Old Turkish before Ataturk, who use now, and Turks now use the Latin alphabet, Persian, Urdu, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute, and Malay. In other words, this form of writing has spread quite far in Asia and to the east. But there's another kind of writing system I'd like to talk about right now, outside of an alphabet, and also a combination of it and the alphabet. And this is the syllabary. Now, a syllabary is a writing system that actually uses a consonant sound and a vowel together. So you have one symbol for ba, one for na, one for ma, one for mu, one for pu, and so on. Consequently, you get a great many more symbols in your writing system than you do if you simply use an alphabet. Now, one of the most interesting syllabaries that I'm going to talk to you about and show you in just a minute is called Devanagari, which is a Sanskrit word which means holy city. And this was the particular kind of syllabary and alphabet that was used to write ancient Sanskrit. Now, interestingly enough, in India today, the Arabic alphabet is used to write one form of what we call Hindustani when we look at it as a spoken language, and the Devanagari used to write another form. In other words, we have one spoken language in several dialects called Hindustani. But when it is written by people who are mainly Muslims and have a Persian influence in their vocabulary, it's called Urdu and is written in the Arabic alphabet. When it's for Hindus, who have more Sanskrit words in their written language, it's called Hindi. Let me show you what this particular thing looks like. What I have here are two words in Hindustani, the spoken language underlying these two, the word bap for father and the word bulna, meaning forget. Now look what happens. In the Devanagari itself, what we have is a syllabary. This particular thing represents a B. If I don't put any mark after it, I'll read the vowel sound ah right with it. Notice, this would be bop. This is a long ah, and this is a p, but would be read pa if I didn't have that little mark under it. That little mark tells me I shouldn't say bapa, but should say bop. Here's what it looks like in the Urdu. Bulna, meaning forget. Again, the Devanagari, this is a BH and this is a U. This is an L, so I read bul, na. And since there is no mark under that, I don't read it na. I read it na and don't read it bul, but bulna. In other words, a combination of syllabary and alphabet. Now I want to show you another very interesting writing system. And this writing system, of course, is the Chinese characters. Now here on the board, we have what actually is a welcome to Will Rogers, Jr. when he went to San Francisco and was made honorary citizen of Chinatown. I'm using this because I want to show you that this, to us, very ancient kind of writing system can be used to represent the most modern ideas and concepts the Chinese talk about today. What this says now, as I read it down, and we always read it this way, what this says, the first four of those characters there, reading down in the right-hand column, is Wei Lu La Chia. Wei Lu La Chia R. This one says R. Wei Lu La Chia means Will Rogers, R, number 2, Jr. Wei Lu La Chia R. Now, actually, these particular things stand for morphemes, these particular symbols here. And this particular morpheme would be read in Chinese, Wei, dignified, road, pull, send. Now, obviously, those particular things make no sense there. So the Chinese, what the Chinese does is to say, well, this must be somebody's name. So they get pretty close to Wei Lu Lai Chia, Will Rogers, R, Jr. Now, it goes on and welcomes him and so on. And these two characters right here are read Chuan and Zhen. And what they mean is, Chuan means deliver, and Zhen means actual. Actual deliver means television. In other words, the actual delivery. So here are two characters which now represent two morphemes, not two words, but two morphemes. A word of two morphemes, television. And this is what television looks like in Chinese.
Now, what happens in a writing system like this is this, that this particular system, since it represents morphemes, as though we wrote, well, for instance, suppose we wrote slowly, the ly on li, all the time, just one character, and it signified adverb, say that kind of thing. This particular kind of system can be used now for all the Chinese languages. In other words, it can be used for Cantonese and for Mandarin, for Fukienese, for all of the Chinese languages. And it's read, each one of them reads different morphemes in each one. In other words, it is a morphemic writing system. These are not words, but are morphemes. And it can be used equally well for all the Chinese languages, which we've already seen differ as much as Russian does from Greek. Now, how about the English writing system? This is, of course, the one we're most concerned about. Now, English is a writing system which is quite similar in some respects to the Chinese, but that's not the important thing. The important thing about the English writing system is that it is alphabetic. And again, it is that alphabet that we are tracing today. In other words, the English writing system is phonemic. It is based on the principle of one symbol, one sound. Now, of course, it's not very consistent, as we've already found out. And we do write in morphemes. For instance, here boy, and here boys. This is the possessive plural. Actually, that little apostrophe out there is the symbol for a morpheme. It says possessive. This says plural, and that says possessive, as we well know. Now, also in the English writing system, we have a lot of homophones. And we don't write the homophones the same way. That is, words that sound alike. We spell them differently. Raise is quite different from raise. This means to elevate, and this means to tear down. And this, the rays of the sun. All of these have the same phonemes in them, R-E-Y-Z, but they are spelled three different ways. In other words, we're doing something like the Chinese. We are actually drawing pictures of morphemes here. Here's a morpheme picture, and here's a morpheme picture. Here's a morpheme which consists of a whole word. Now, also in our writing system, we have another kind of thing, which is quite like this Chinese business of reading morphemes. This thing would be read in English. 1 and 2 is 3. Okay? In German, the same thing would be read ein und zwei ist drei. In French, un et deux et trois sont trois. In other words, these particular kinds of symbols in our writing system now stand for morphemes and can be read by different words in different languages. This is very much the way the Chinese system works, morphemic. Now, writing systems, again, are systems, and this I have to constantly remind you of. They aren't pictures, they aren't haphazard, they are systems, and like all human behavior, they are patterned, and we can find out how they work. Just as when we analyze language, we analyze the phonemes. We can analyze the graphemes of a writing system. And graphemes have allographs, just the way phonemes have allophones. That means predictable variations. For instance, a very good example of this are the regular predictable positional variations of the sigma in Greek. Now, sigma is the name for the letter S in Greek. And when you write it in Greek, when it begins a word, it's written that way, like a little O, sort of, so to speak, with a little tail on it. But when it's at the end of the word, it looks very much like our form of S, just about like that. Sigma and tos. In other words, these are positional, predictable variations, allographs, of the grapheme that we could write sigma. In other words, writing systems must be studied carefully. And what must also be studied carefully is how those writing systems fit the spoken language. Please let us remember that always language is prior to writing, that writing is a symbolization of language, and that when we are studying writing systems, actually what we are time and time again studying is how they correspond. Are they mainly phonemic? Are they morphemic? In other words, we need to know the nature of the structure of the language, and very definitely the nature of the structure of the writing system to see how they correspond. Now, when we have a writing system that is as good, say, as the Finnish or the Turkish, the fit between phoneme and grapheme is almost 100%. But in a language like English, the fit between phoneme and grapheme is not too good. In other words, our big problem in learning how to spell English and learning how to read English is the fact that we have, although we have essentially a phonemic writing system, an alphabetic writing system, we still have various kinds of morphemic representations in our system. And this is what makes it tough. Now, I'd like to say a word about written languages. Remember, the written language, that is the literary part, if you will, the thing that is done in the writing system, and the spoken language are really part of a larger complex of language, period. In other words, they're two different forms, if you will, but obviously closely related, and the spoken language is always prior. Now, what happens in any literate society like our own is that as we become educated and read the best that has been said and thought in the world in our literature, we learn certain words that come to us only from the written language. And these particular words then become part of our spoken vocabulary. Oftentimes, we actually have words that are only in our written vocabulary. They aren't in our spoken vocabulary. And sometimes when we bring them over, we don't know exactly how to pronounce them because we've never heard them before. But here's the important thing. Written language is constantly influencing spoken language, and spoken language is always prior to written language. So you get a sort of feedback, if you will. And as people become literate, more and more people become literate, we find that the spoken language becomes more and more uniform. Therefore, the connection between the written language and the spoken language is extremely important. Now, what we try to do today, and very rapidly, of course, is to summarize for you the history of our alphabet, and at the same time showing that it started with the Egyptians, and from this famous and amazing hieroglyphic writing system, cumbersome as it was, to show you that the alphabet was invented only once, and then spread to the east and spread to the west in the various forms that we have. The alphabet also, the most important, obviously, writing system we have and the most efficient writing system. But there were other writing systems. We talked about syllabaries, and we talked about the famous morphemic writing system, the Chinese, which is oftentimes thought of being a word writing system, but which is not, or a picture writing system, which it is not, but a morphemic writing system. In other words, we've talked about writing systems, we talked about how they are in allographs, I mean how we have graphemes and allographs and so on, but mainly the alphabet is what we're concerned about. Now, on our next program, we're going to be talking about the whole matter of the application of linguistics to the teaching of reading. In other words, the whole matter of how the linguist can help in this business of putting linguistic structure and writing structure together to help Johnny read better. Be with us.